I was telling you that I went to Oxford for a year to be with the Carmelites, and when I came back, I went back to the old first cottage that I'd been living in Ballynahinch before I went to Oxford. But then when I came back, I re-rented the old cottage down by the mouth of the Owenmore River that I'd been in. But I was working now, not inside in Ballynahinch, but outside. So I would cycle home at 5 o'clock every evening and be home around 5:10, and I'd be putting on the fire, and I'd hear a neighbour, Martin Hollidan, coming down the road. Martin was a neighbour of mine over beyond McCahill's. He was living beyond McCahill's. And Martin was one of these old Connemara men, you know, who would always announce he's coming. He'd be talking to his dog or fighting with the dog, or he'd be saying something to himself, or reciting a bit of poem, or singing a bit of song, or set up a whistle, or he'd be doing something. Because he would never just arrive in and topple you. But every evening about 5:10, or between 10 and 5:20, I'd hear Martin coming down the road. And there were some evenings like when I would hear Martin coming and say, "Jeez, Martin, God bless you and spare the head, but couldn't you give me an out to myself now? Do you know, I've been up in Ballynahinch all day, like in the banter with people, and it would be lovely to have an hour of silence myself." But I'd hear Martin coming, and Martin come in fighting with the dog Rover, like, and I hope you don't mind now if this is a little bit colloquial. You know, sometimes I would have to use words that maybe, you know, you wouldn't get a bishop's imprimatur for, but so it'll have some local colour. So Martin would stand on my threshold of the kitchen, like, and I'd be inside, maybe stoking the fire or something, and is the whore of a Kerry man in? You know, he'd be talking to himself, so he'd come through the door anyway, and so he'd sit down and take out his pipe, and he'd be there till 9:20. He'd sit there then from about 5:20 to 9:20, and at 9:20 he'd leave and go up to watch the news and television in Mikey Keneally's. But he'd tell all the old stories, and even if Martin had told me the story 10 times or 100 times, and I'd say, "Martin, yeah, I know that story," but he'd still insist on telling it, and he'd give me all the details, you know. But Martin was one of my great teachers. Martin was a great, great teacher. He, in some sense, really initiated me back into rural Ireland after an academic education. He re-initiated me back into the ways of rural Ireland, the thinking of rural Ireland, the feel of rural Ireland, the smell of rural Ireland. Because I was cut turf for him, and I was often in the bog with him, and I would save hay with him and go up to visit him, and he was always coming down to see me in the evening anyway. But Martin then became pension age, and there was no point at all in Martin like kind of just getting the pension normally. He had to get it through Bobby Malloy, so he came down to me, and I was one that would be writing letters and things like that, and so I must write to Bobby Malloy and get it through Bobby Malloy, you know. So I wrote to Bobby Malloy and said, like, Martin Hollidan is of pension age, and could you please see to it that he gets his pension? And Martin got a letter down from the Oireachtas, you know, so that was it. Martin would now got the pension, so that meant that now every Friday Martin would go into Roundstone to collect the pension, and Martin was a big drinker, but he was a social drinker. He wasn't a solitary drinker or a bitter drinker. I mean, it gave Martin life. It expanded him inwardly and gave him full scope. Don't fence him in, you know. So Martin would drink, and he'd come home then with 2 big shopping bags, and he was a great cook. Martin was a wonderful cook, and he had 5 or 6 cats, and between them all, like, they'd have great feastings and feedings, particularly on a Friday after Martin came home. And then Friday he would come around, and he'd have little presents for me, because Martin would know, like, that he had some idea that I helped to get the pension and things like that. Anyway, his kind of generosity, even if I'd never got the pension, it wouldn't matter. Martin would come with little gifts for me, and particularly if he was coming with gifts, Martin would be kind of swelled with importance. You'd hear him 100 yards up the road, that kind of evening, because he'd be coming in with gifts, and he'd be a bit drunk. Like, he wouldn't be drunk now, but he'd have a few odd pints in him. So Martin would come in, and again, like, to be, you know, is the Kerryman in, you know, or is the whore of a Kerryman in, you know, as I'd hear him come in the door fighting with his dog Rover, and then he'd come in through the kitchen and look into the living room, and he'd see that I was inside, and I'd say, "Good evening, Martin." He'd say, "Well, John," you know, some evenings he'd say, "Well, John," this little Barry Fitzgerald of a man, "Well, John, I do know you to be light on the brown bread and the see the cheese." So poor Martin would have to be brown, you know the wonderful phrase, light on the brown bread, now glowing out, you know, you to be light on the cheddar cheese, the see the cheese, and sometimes maybe he'd have a brack for me, and Martin would come in, and of course Martin would have been drinking all day, like, or not all day, but he'd have quite a few drinks in him anyway, and some of those evenings Martin wouldn't sit deeply back into the chair at all. Martin would be sitting on the edge of the chair, and he wouldn't take out the pipe, and he wouldn't be smoking it, and they'd be kind of edging him, and he'd be wanting to go place, and I don't know exactly what Martin would be wanting. He'd be wanting me to take him up to walk all the way back up to Ballynahinch with him, and of course, like, I suppose I'd be cross. Some even said, "Jesus, I've just come down from Ballynahinch now, like, and I don't want to be going back up to Ballynahinch again, because there'll be the whole night drinking and talking, and I don't want that, you know, and then I have to be facing work again in the morning." But So sometimes I say to Martin, well, Jesus, you can fester away there now. You can roast away there. And I'd say, Martin, would have a cup of tea? And say, no tea, no nothing, because there's nothing now will cut the thirst. Like, you know, the thirst, the scum that's on his tongue now, nothing will cut that but whiskey. You know, I know that's a bit thinking. Like, so sometimes I'd let him fester away there and sizzle away there for a while, but then he'd get the better of me. I'd look over at him and Jesus, like, you know, just the sheer appearance of him, the forlornness of him, you know, and him disappointed in me, and me his best friend, like, and I wouldn't even walk the road to Ballynahinch with him. So finally I'd give in and say, okay, Martin, we'll go up, and then new life would come into Martin, resurrection life would be into Martin immediately, and he'd get up and he'd bang the lapels of his coat together, and he'd shake my hand, spit in the hand and shake my hand, and say, like, the coldest day in winter and the hottest day in summer. You know, these wonderful kind of declarations of loyalty. You know, come hell or high water, you're my best friend, John. And he'd look up at me, and having made that statement, he'd know that I was still not appeased, you know, that I was still kind of cross. And he'd say, no use hanging a man without a head, John. No use hanging a man without a head. And I'd say, Martin, no. And he'd won that argument. So Christ, like. So out the door we'd go, and I'd have to link arms with Martin. And poor Martin, like, you know, he had a bad knee. I remember once I got a very bad flu, and the doctor came. Someone, neighbour, phoned and said, come over to see John anyway. And the doctor came, and Martin was in the house that evening, and he looked after me anyway, the doctor did. And he asked Martin, is there anything wrong with you? And Martin said, nothing except my knee. And the doctor, Dr. Hodges, I remember, felt Martin, an old English army doctor, felt Martin's knee, and he could make no sense in the world of Martin's knee. How he didn't know how those bones could have been shuffled, how that deck of bones could have been shuffled, and that they were shuffled. He could make no sense, anatomical sense at all of Martin's knee. So he prescribed nothing. You have to live with that knee now, Martin. And I remember one evening, like, poor Martin was walking across the yard, and I said, Christ, Martin, is the knee bad with you again? And Martin said, well, now, John, there's nothing in the wide earthly world wrong with that knee, except that the power is clean gone from it. The poor man, so, like, I'd walk out, and I know the knee was a grateful partner, so I'd have to link arms with him, and off up the road, and we'd go up past the Anglers Return, and then we'd be out into the great dark, walking up the road to Ballynahinch, up by the Owenmore River, and we wouldn't see the Owenmore River now, we'd just hear it. So Martin, I remember, one of the first nights it happened, Martin said to me, shot in the road, John, and I'd lost the kind of, I didn't pick up the cue, and he said, damn it, Saul, he said, shot in the road. And I said, what do you mean, Martin? He said, tell a story. Don't you know the story of the bonfire and the son? When they set out one morning, the father said to the son, tell us a story. And the son told the father a story, and then they never felt the journey. So I said, Martin, no story comes to mind. So that night, anyway, poor Martin told me a lovely, lovely story on the way up to Ballynahinch. But I won't tell you that story now, because, you know, that's not part of what I want to do this evening. But he told me a lovely story, and in no time at all, we were walking in the door of Ballynahinch, and Martin started drinking, and I started drinking, and by closing time, Martin had no problems in the world about the existence of God. Proud of God he was, proud of God and his blessed mother. So he went on for a heavy theological hour or two, being proud of God and his blessed mother. But the barman was calling time, and finally I had to go over and prevail upon Martin. Martin, God bless you. Now, it's wonderful that you're so proud of God. There's the rest of us, like him, we've trouble believing in God, but you're proud of him. I'm proud of his blessed mother and the Holy Mass within and Roundstone. So I kind of linked arms with Martin and got him out, and walked up past the receptionist, who was delighted to see the two of us going away in the night, so the she could close up, and up the 3 steps and into the lobby, and then out the door. And we were standing outside under the light, the outside door light there, and Martin again stood, and, you know, my best friend John, he was spitting in the hand, and my best friend on the coldest day in winter and the hottest day in summer, and, you know, no use hanging a man without a head, John. So he'd go through the whole liturgy again several times in that night. He'd go through that liturgy, and he said, he was talking about a girl then in the bar who'd sung a song, you know, and wasn't she a fine girl and a grand girl and a mighty girl? Do you know, in the old days, in the Fianna Fine, on Fariga, Fod, Luim, Luim, Dinah, you can't just say, it is ungenerous to say that a woman is a grand girl. Christ, you have to go on and on and on. She's a grand girl and she's a fine girl.